The courtroom was packed. The low murmur of conversations filled the air but fell silent the moment the judge entered and the trial began. Seated at the defense table was Minerva Minnie Hargrove, a woman of striking presence, her golden hair perfectly styled. She clutched a large gold crucifix tightly against her chest, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Her attorney, Herschel Boone, a tall, lanky man with a slightly wrinkled suit, whispered something in her ear, but she seemed too distracted to respond. Her gaze flickered toward the side door, as if she were expecting something, or dreading it. Then the door swung open. Officer Buford Tate entered, holding the leash of Knox, a highly trained German Shepherd K9. Knox was well known for his impeccable tracking skills and unwavering discipline. He had been in dozens of courtrooms before, always composed, always controlled. But today, something was different. As soon as Knox stepped into the room, his body went rigid. His sharp eyes locked onto Minnie. A low growl rumbled from his throat, his fur bristling, and then, without warning, he erupted into furious barking. The sharp, commanding barks echoed through the courtroom like gunfire. Every head turned toward him. The judge, Otis Wainwright, frowned and banged his gavel lightly. "Officer Tate, control that animal," he ordered, irritation lacing his voice. But Buford was frozen in place, stunned. Knox never behaved like this. The dog was straining against his leash, teeth bared, eyes fixated not just on Minnie, but on the crucifix she held so tightly. Her face turned pale, her lips trembled, and her grip on the necklace tightened even further, as if trying to protect it from something. "Make him stop. I haven't done anything." Minnie's voice wavered, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the fear of being attacked, it was the fear of being exposed. The prosecutor, Zephaniah Zeph Caldwell, leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. He knew Knox, and he knew the dog didn't make mistakes. So why was he so fixated on this woman, and more specifically on her necklace? The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. The judge banged his gavel again, harder this time. "This has gone far enough. Officer Tate, remove the dog immediately." But before Buford could react, Knox made his move. With a powerful lunge, he broke free from his handler's grip. The courtroom gasped as the K9 charged forward, leaping straight at Minnie. Minnie barely had time to react. As Knox lunged, her chair screeched against the polished courtroom floor as she tried to push herself away. But it was too late. The powerful German Shepherd leaped onto her, his teeth clamping onto the gold crucifix, yanking it from her grasp. The chain snapped, the metal clattering against the floor with a sharp, eerie sound. The entire room fell into stunned silence. Knox didn't bite her. He didn't attack. He only wanted one thing, the necklace. And now that it was on the floor, the dog hovered over it, growling low and deep, as if guarding something sinister. Buford rushed forward, grabbing Knox's leash and pulling him back with effort. The tension in the room was suffocating. Minnie sat frozen, her hands trembling, her wide eyes locked on the crucifix lying at Knox's feet. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and for the first time, the composed, dignified woman looked truly terrified. But why? The courtroom, which had been filled with murmurs just moments ago, was now deathly silent. All eyes were on the small golden object on the floor. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry anymore. It was something more, something dangerous. Zeph Caldwell was the first to move. The prosecutor stood from his seat, his sharp gaze locked on Minnie before shifting to the crucifix. With measured steps, he walked toward it, then crouched down. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket before carefully picking up the piece of jewelry. The weight of the cross felt heavier than it should. He turned it over in his palm, and then, his expression hardened. There was something wedged in the tiny crevices of the ornate design. Something dark, something dried. A horrible realization crept into his mind. The judge cleared his throat, his voice uneasy. "Mr. Caldwell, is there a problem?" Zeph straightened up, gripping the crucifix tightly in the cloth. "Your Honor," he said slowly, his voice steady but cold, "I believe we need this sent for forensic testing immediately." He turned to the bailiff, holding out the evidence. "There's a substance on this necklace, and I have reason to believe it's blood." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Minnie, who had remained silent, suddenly sprang to her feet. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, but the panic in her voice betrayed her. Her carefully crafted mask was slipping. She knew exactly what they would find. Buford exchanged a look with Zeph. Knox, still tense, let out another low growl, his eyes never leaving Minnie. Zeph wasn't done. He took a step toward her. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, his voice quieter now but no less commanding. "Whose blood is on this cross?" Minnie's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. For a brief moment, the entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for an answer. But Minnie Hargrove wasn't about to give them one. Instead, she bolted. The moment Minnie bolted, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps filled the air as she spun on her heel and ran toward the exit, her heels clicking frantically against the polished floor. The bailiff moved to block her, but she was faster than expected, shoving past him with surprising strength for a woman her age. But she had made a critical mistake. She had forgotten about Knox. The K9, still fixated on her, lunged forward, his powerful legs propelling him like a missile. "Knox, heel!" Buford commanded, but the dog ignored him. Years of training had conditioned Knox to recognize when someone was fleeing for a reason. And in his world, running meant guilt. Within seconds, he caught up to Minnie, leaping up and knocking her off balance. She let out a startled cry as she crashed to the ground, her hands barely breaking her fall. The courtroom collectively flinched as her head nearly hit the base of the judge's bench. Silence fell, broken only by her frantic, shuddering breaths. Buford rushed over, grabbing Knox's leash and pulling him back. "Jesus, Minnie, what the hell are you running for?" he barked, his face red with anger and confusion. Minnie didn't answer. She just sat there, stunned, her palms flat against the floor as if the ground beneath her had become unsteady. Her carefully applied makeup had started to smudge, and for the first time, she looked nothing like the composed socialite she had been when she walked into that courtroom. She looked guilty. Zeph wasted no time. He crouched beside her, his voice sharp but steady. "Mrs. Hargrove, I'm going to ask you one more time. Whose blood is on that cross?" His eyes bore into her, unrelenting. Minnie's lips quivered. Her gaze darted around the room, as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. Then, finally, in the smallest voice, she whispered, "I don't know." The room was so quiet that even Knox's panting sounded deafening. Zeph let out a slow breath, but he wasn't convinced. "That's not going to cut it. The lab will have results in hours, maybe less. If you don't start talking now, we'll find out the truth without you." He leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "And I promise you, Minnie, whatever story you're trying to hide, Knox already knows the ending." A shiver ran through her body. Her hands clenched into fists. She was trapped and she knew it. But before she could say another word, the judge's voice rang through the courtroom, firm and final. "Bailiff, take Mrs. Hargrove into custody." Minnie let out a quiet, broken gasp as cold steel cuffs locked around her wrists. And as she was pulled to her feet, her once perfect world began to crumble. Minnie's knees buckled slightly as the cold handcuffs tightened around her wrists. She wasn't used to being restrained. She had spent her entire life controlling every situation, every conversation, every rumor. But now, for the first time, she was powerless. The bailiff led her toward the side exit, and though her steps were slow, her mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. This trial was supposed to be routine, just a formality. No one was supposed to question her. No one was supposed to look too closely. But then there was Knox, that damn dog. As she reached the doorway, she turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto Zeph Caldwell. The prosecutor stood still, watching her carefully. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't celebrating. He was simply observing, waiting. He knew something wasn't right, and he wasn't going to stop until he found out what. Minnie's breath caught in her throat as a single terrifying thought crossed her mind. What if the blood wasn't the only thing they found? Meanwhile, Buford knelt beside Knox, rubbing his hand over the dog's thick fur. "Good boy," he muttered under his breath, though there was a deep crease in his brow. He had worked with Knox for years, trusted the dog more than most people. And yet, something about this case made his stomach churn. He glanced over at Zeph, who was still gripping the blood-stained crucifix with the handkerchief. "You really think she's capable of something like this?" Buford asked. Zeph didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the cross, turning it over in his fingers. The dried substance embedded in the ornate crevices was unmistakable human blood. But there was something else. Something about the weight of the cross, the way it felt just slightly off. Zeph narrowed his eyes. "I don't just think she's capable," he finally said, his voice low and firm. "I think she's hiding something bigger than we realize." Knox let out a low whine, shifting his stance. He was still restless, still alert. Buford noticed it immediately. The dog wasn't satisfied. He had found the blood, found the deception, but he wasn't finished. Buford's gut twisted. Knox had never been wrong before. If the dog was still uneasy, then there was more to this case. Something deeper, something worse. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the moment of silence. "We'll reconvene once the forensic results come in," he announced. But as the gavel struck the wood, a chilling realization settled over the room. This case was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed softly as Zeph Caldwell stood over the evidence table, staring at the crucifix in front of him. It had been bagged and sent to the forensic lab within minutes of the courtroom incident, and the preliminary results had just come in. The blood on the cross was human, as expected. But what sent a cold chill through Zeph's spine was the identity of the DNA match. It wasn't just anyone's blood. It belonged to a man who had been missing for over a decade. Buford leaned over, scanning the report in Zeph's hands. "No damn way," he muttered. His fingers gripped the edge of the table as he read the name aloud. Samuel Hargrove. The weight of the words settled between them like a lead weight. Samuel Hargrove, Minnie's husband, officially declared dead 9 years ago after mysteriously vanishing. His disappearance had been the talk of the town for months before fading into obscurity. Minnie had played the grieving widow perfectly, but now, thanks to Knox, her carefully crafted lie was unraveling. Zeph exhaled sharply and tapped his fingers against the table. So either she kept a blood-stained necklace as some kind of twisted memento, he paused, shaking his head, or this case is about to get a whole lot bigger than we thought. Buford let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. Bigger? Hell, Zeph, if Samuel's blood is on that cross, we're no longer dealing with fraud or obstruction. We're looking at murder. In the corner of the room, Knox sat on his haunches, his ears perked and his eyes sharp as ever. He wasn't restless anymore, he was watching, waiting. He had led them to the first clue, but there was more. Buford knew that look. He had seen it too many times before. Knox wasn't done. Zeph rubbed a hand over his jaw, his mind racing. Minnie bolted the second she realized what we were about to find, he murmured. If she panicked that fast, then she knows exactly where the rest of Samuel is. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. If the cross held blood, what else had Minnie been hiding? And more importantly, where was the body? Buford glanced at Knox, then back at Zeph. I think it's time we let the dog lead the way. The wind howled through the towering oak trees as Buford Tate stepped out of the patrol car, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots barely audible over the rustling leaves. Knox was already alert, his ears high, nostrils flaring as he took in the scents around them. They had arrived at the Hargrove estate, an aging but once grand property that sat at the edge of town, shrouded in darkness and secrets. The white-painted siding had dulled with years of neglect, vines creeping up the sides like nature's attempt to reclaim it. But Buford wasn't here to admire the architecture. He was here to find the truth. Zeph Caldwell shut the car door and exhaled, scanning the estate with narrowed eyes. She never sold the place. His voice was thoughtful, calculating. After Samuel disappeared, she could have gotten rid of it, moved on. but she didn't. She held onto it for all these years. He turned to Buford, his expression unreadable. Why? Buford inhaled sharply, his breath visible in the cold air. Because maybe this house isn't just a memory. He glanced toward Knox, who was already sniffing the ground with precise determination. Maybe it's a crime scene. Knox moved with purpose, his powerful frame cutting through the overgrown yard as he followed an invisible trail only his nose could detect. He sniffed along the cracked stone pathway, past the rotting porch steps, weaving through weeds and patches of dead grass. Every few feet, his body stiffened, his tail flicking in anticipation. He was onto something. Buford and Zeph exchanged a glance before following the dog, their boots crunching over dried leaves. The house loomed beside them, its dark windows like hollow eyes, watching. Knox suddenly changed direction, pulling toward the back of the property. He moved faster now, his posture shifting from curious to focused. And then he stopped. His muscular frame went rigid as he stood before an old, dilapidated toolshed. The structure was barely standing, its wooden walls warped from years of rain and neglect. The door, once painted a deep green, now hung crooked on rusted hinges, as if barely clinging to its frame. And then Knox growled. Not a warning, not a reaction to a stranger. This was something different. This was a discovery. Buford felt a chill crawl up his spine as Zeph pulled out a flashlight. "All right," Zeph muttered, adjusting his gloves. "Let's see what she's been hiding." He reached for the shed door, pushing it open with a creak that sent a shiver through the night air. The scent hit them instantly. Damp earth, rotting wood, and something else. Something worse. Buford's grip tightened on his flashlight as he swept the beam across the small, cluttered space. Old gardening tools, rusted shears, a broken wheelbarrow. But then, near the back wall, a patch of disturbed dirt. Loose soil, uneven, as if it had been tampered with. Knox let out a sharp bark and pawed at the ground, his claws scraping against the dirt. They had found it. The thing Minnie Hargrove had been so desperate to keep buried. Zeph inhaled deeply, the reality settling over him like a weight. They weren't just looking at evidence anymore. They were standing over a grave. Zeph turned to Buford, his voice low but firm. "Call forensics." His grip tightened on his flashlight as he stared at the ground. "We're digging tonight." The wind howled through the towering oak trees as Buford Tate stepped out of the patrol car, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots barely audible over the rustling leaves. Knox was already alert, his ears high, nostrils flaring as he took in the scents around them. They had arrived at the Hargrove estate, an aging but once grand property that sat at the edge of town, shrouded in darkness and secrets. The white-painted siding had dulled with years of neglect, vines creeping up the sides like nature's attempt to reclaim it. But Buford wasn't here to admire the architecture. He was here to find the truth. Zeph Caldwell shut the car door and exhaled, scanning the estate with narrowed eyes. "She never sold the place." His voice was thoughtful, calculating. "After Samuel disappeared, she could have gotten rid of it, moved on. But she didn't. She held onto it for all these years." He turned to Buford, his expression unreadable. "Why?" Buford inhaled sharply, his breath visible in the cold air. "Because maybe this house isn't just a memory." He glanced toward Knox, who was already sniffing the ground with precise determination. "Maybe it's a crime scene." Knox moved with purpose, his powerful frame cutting through the overgrown yard as he followed an invisible trail only his nose could detect. He sniffed along the cracked stone pathway, past the rotting porch steps, weaving through weeds and patches of dead grass. Every few feet, his body stiffened, his tail flicking in anticipation. He was onto something. Buford and Zeph exchanged a glance before following the dog, their boots crunching over dried leaves. The house loomed beside them, its dark windows like hollow eyes, watching. Knox suddenly changed direction, pulling toward the back of the property. He moved faster now, his posture shifting from curious to focused. And then he stopped. His muscular frame went rigid as he stood before an old, dilapidated toolshed. The structure was barely standing, its wooden walls warped from years of rain and neglect. The door, once painted a deep green, now hung crooked on rusted hinges, as if barely clinging to its frame. And then Knox growled. Not a warning, not a reaction to a stranger. This was something different. This was a discovery. Buford felt a chill crawl up his spine as Zeph pulled out a flashlight. "All right," Zeph muttered, adjusting his gloves. "Let's see what she's been hiding." He reached for the shed door, pushing it open with a creak that sent a shiver through the night air. The scent hit them instantly. Damp earth, rotting wood, and something else. Something worse. Buford's grip tightened on his flashlight as he swept the beam across the small, cluttered space. Old gardening tools, rusted shears, a broken wheelbarrow. But then, near the back wall, a patch of disturbed dirt. Loose soil, uneven, as if it had been tampered with. Knox let out a sharp bark and pawed at the ground, his claws scraping against the dirt. They had found it. The thing Minnie Hargrove had been so desperate to keep buried. Zeph inhaled deeply, the reality settling over him like a weight. They weren't just looking at evidence anymore. They were standing over a grave. Zeph turned to Buford, his voice low but firm. "Call forensics." His grip tightened on his flashlight as he stared at the ground. "We're digging tonight." The sharp beam of Zeph's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the disturbed patch of earth inside the toolshed. The smell of damp soil mixed with something fouler, something wrong, clung to the air. Knox stood rigid, his muscles tensed. His amber eyes locked on the ground as he let out another low, warning growl. He knew. The dog didn't need DNA results or an autopsy report. He had already solved the case in the only way he knew how. Now, it was up to the humans to catch up. Buford stepped back, pulling his radio from his belt. "This is Officer Tate. We need a forensic team at the Hargrove estate immediately. Possible burial site discovered. Bring cadaver dogs." Static crackled before a dispatcher responded, but Buford barely heard it. He was too focused on the site in front of him. He had worked homicide for years, but there was something uniquely unsettling about this case. A missing husband, a blood-stained cross, a panicked woman who ran before anyone even accused her. And now this. Zeph crouched beside the disturbed earth, running a gloved hand over the loose soil. It was soft, recently turned. This was dug up before. His voice was barely above a whisper. He grabbed a small garden spade from the corner of the shed and began to carefully scrape away the top layer of dirt. With each movement, the smell grew stronger. Buford tightened his jaw, standing back as Zeph worked. There was no doubt about it. Something had been buried here. Minutes passed, tension thick in the air. Then, the blade of Zeph's spade hit something solid. A dull clink. He paused, glancing up at Buford before reaching down, fingers brushing against the object. Slowly, he lifted it from the earth. A rusted tin box. Not bones. Not a body. Buford frowned. "The hell is that?" Zeph didn't answer. He pried the lid open, and inside, wrapped in brittle, yellowed cloth, were old photographs. Letters. A wedding ring. And then, at the very bottom, a second crucifix. Identical to the one Minnie had clutched in court. Buford exhaled sharply. 2 crosses. His voice was low, almost disbelieving. "What the hell is going on here, Zeph?" Zeph studied the box, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. Minnie hadn't buried a body. She had hidden a secret. And whatever it was, it had been worth more to her than Samuel's life. He turned to Buford, his expression dark. "This case just changed. This isn't just about a murder." He held up the crucifix, its golden surface still gleaming despite years in the dirt. "This is about what Samuel knew before he died." Zeph turned the second crucifix over in his hand, its cool metal slick with dirt. 2 identical crosses. One had been wrapped around Minnie's throat in court, covered in blood. The other had been buried deep beneath the old toolshed, hidden away with letters and photographs. Why? He could feel the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. This wasn't just a grave, it was a message, a warning. Samuel Hargrove hadn't just disappeared. He had been erased. Buford exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "So what now?" His voice was lower, more cautious. He had seen plenty of murder cases in his time, but this one was getting stranger by the second. If there was no body here, where the hell was Samuel? And more importantly, what did he know that got him killed? Zeph didn't answer right away. He unwrapped the yellowed cloth inside the box, revealing brittle photographs beneath it. He pulled one out, brushing off the dirt. It was old, maybe 15 years, but the faces were clear. Samuel Hargrove stood in front of a small church, his arm around another man. A man Zeph recognized instantly. His pulse quickened. "Buford." He held up the photo, his jaw tightening. "That's Reverend Elijah Porter." Buford's expression darkened. "You're kidding." He took the photo, staring at the grinning man beside Samuel. Reverend Porter had been a respected figure in the community for decades, a preacher whose sermons had filled pews every Sunday. He was also a close friend of Minnie Hargrove. The revelation sent a new kind of chill through Buford. Was this case even about Samuel at all? Or was it about what the Reverend had been hiding? Knox let out a sharp bark, startling them both. The dog's nose was still to the ground, sniffing around the shed's foundation. He pawed at the dirt, whining, frustrated. Buford's stomach tightened. Knox still wasn't done. That meant this wasn't the only secret buried here. Zeph folded the photograph and tucked it into his pocket. He met Buford's eyes, his voice steady but tense. "We need to bring Minnie in for questioning now." Buford nodded. "And we need to talk to the good Reverend." He turned to Knox, who was still tense, still watching the ground. Buford exhaled slowly. "But first, we find out what else this dog knows." The drive back to the precinct was tense. Zeph sat in the passenger seat, staring at the old photograph in his hands. The image of Samuel Hargrove and Reverend Elijah Porter seemed harmless at first glance. Just two men standing in front of a church, smiling. But the fact that it had been buried, hidden away along with that second crucifix, told Zeph everything he needed to know. This was the key to the entire case, the missing piece, and Minnie had spent the last decade making sure no one ever found it. Buford gripped the wheel tighter as they neared the station. "You think Porter knows we're coming?" His voice was gruff, his eyes locked on the road ahead. Zeph exhaled sharply. "If he didn't before, he will soon." The moment they started asking questions, the entire town would know. Porter was powerful, respected, untouchable, and now they were about to rip his reputation apart. At the precinct, Minnie Hargrove sat in a cold, gray interrogation room, her hands still cuffed. Her carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack. She had refused to say a word since her arrest, her blue eyes darting between the walls, the door, and the large one-way mirror reflecting her own image back at her. She wasn't waiting for a lawyer. She was waiting for someone to come save her. When Zeph entered the room, he didn't sit down. He just placed the photograph in front of her and watched. Minnie's breath hitched. Her pupils dilated as she took in the image, her fingers twitching slightly against the table. But she didn't speak, didn't move. She knew exactly what this meant. Buford leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "We know about the second cross," he said, his tone firm but calm. "And we know whose blood was on the first one." He let the words settle. "So I'll ask you one last time, Minnie. Where is Samuel's body?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Minnie let out a slow, shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before whispering, "There is no body." Zeph and Buford exchanged a look. No body? The weight of those words sent a chill through the room. If Samuel wasn't dead, then where the hell had he been for the last 10 years? The door to the interrogation room suddenly burst open. A younger officer stood in the doorway, his face pale, his breathing heavy. "Detectives," he said, swallowing hard. "You need to see this." Buford straightened. "See what?" The officer hesitated. "It's Reverend Porter." He exhaled sharply. "He's gone." Zeph felt his pulse quicken. "Gone?" he repeated, his voice sharper than he intended. The young officer nodded. "His house was empty when we went to bring him in. Cars still in the driveway. No signs of a struggle. It's like he just vanished. The weight of those words sank into the room. Reverend Elijah Porter had known this moment was coming, and he had run. Buford turned to Minnie, his eyes narrowing. "Where did he go?" he demanded. Minnie, still seated, let out a quiet, humorless laugh. She wasn't surprised. If anything, she looked relieved. "You'll never find him," she murmured, her voice steady. "He's better at disappearing than Samuel ever was." Zeph slammed a hand on the table, making her flinch. "Enough games, Minnie. You said there was no body. What does that mean?" He leaned in closer, his voice a low growl. "Samuel Hargrove is alive, isn't he?" Minnie's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. The realization hit Buford and Zeph at the same time. Samuel Hargrove hadn't been murdered. He had been hidden. The pieces clicked into place. The bloody cross, the hidden photographs, the second crucifix buried beneath the toolshed. Samuel had uncovered something about Porter, something dangerous, and instead of killing him, they had forced him to disappear. Knox let out a low whine, his tail flicking as he sat near the door, ears twitching. He sensed the tension, the shift in the room. He knew the chase wasn't over. Zeph straightened, shoving the photograph back into his pocket. "We need to put out an APB on Porter now." Buford was already moving, but before he left the room, he turned back to Minnie. "You helped him cover this up for 10 years, he said. "You think he's going to protect you now?" Minnie finally looked up at him, and for the first time that night, fear flickered in her eyes. Buford shook his head. "I hope you prayed as much as you lied, Minnie." Then he walked out. As the station burst into action, officers calling dispatch, reports being filed, tires screeching in the distance. Zeph stood still for a moment, exhaling. The case wasn't over. They had chased a murderer, only to realize their victim had been running too. And somewhere out there, in the dark, Samuel Hargrove and Reverend Elijah Porter were still playing their game of survival. Knox let out a quiet huff, settling beside Zeph's feet. The detective reached down, absently running his fingers through the dog's fur. "Yeah," he muttered under his breath. "Something tells me we're not done yet."